well. I hope you had a great President's Ball. I got to see a couple of you right before. That was very cool. And learn about weird mixed drinks. But yeah. So anyway, like I said, I'm sure that violated some kind of faculty student code. Yes, well, it's recorded now, so we're done. Okay, so good morning, everyone. There are a couple of things that I want us to do today, and this week I think should be pretty good. I mean, I love this stuff, and we're going to talk. I'd like us to finish up the Wasteland today. But we've been talking about so many people that I wanted to at least bring some images in of who these people are, because otherwise it's just so abstract. And I started putting together this PowerPoint. It is by no means complete at all, and it's actually quite dreadfully boring. But there's still some great images in it that I want you to see, and some people that I want you to get to know. And I'll bring more images in as we go along through the class. But for now, I want to just cover some of the people we've talked about. So, fascinating kind of article appeared in February of 1939 in the New York Times, in which they were talking about what is this movement of Christian humanism. And you can see here the names that they give us. This is the theme recurring in many of the writings of some of the most foremost thinkers of our day, such as Irving Babbitt, Paul Elmer More. They don't list Nicholas Berdyaev. They list Berdyaev, but not the Nicholas, Christopher Dawson, and T.S. Eliot. So there's this real movement that's being recognized as early as 1939. This understanding, however, in the way that this article has put it in the Times, is that all of this is referencing back to T.E. Home. That is, they're giving Home credit for starting all of this. Now, that may be true in terms of the movement, but we know that there was almost no overlap between Babbitt and More and Home. So if there was an overlap at all, it came through T.S. Eliot, but it wasn't direct. There's no evidence that Babbitt or More ever even read the works of Home, or that Home had read the works of Babbitt and More, though it's far more likely that he would have read the works of Babbitt and More than they would have read him. So there he is. I told you guys that he's one of these persons who just radiates something when we actually see a picture of him. And I think the picture matters here. This is Home. He's a big guy in all kinds of ways, and you can tell there's a sternness to what he's trying to do. So this is the guy who really creates modern poetry. This is the founder of Imagism, and he dies young. As you can see here, he's very young when he passes away in World War I. He definitely enters into World War I of his own free will. He's not drafted. He enters into it. In fact, he's too old to be drafted. At this point, he's in his 30s, and he wouldn't have been subject to the draft at all. People like Tolkien are a full 10 years younger, 9 years younger. Lewis, they would have the chance not Lewis because he was Irish, but Tolkien would have had the chance of being drafted. They too volunteered. But you can definitely see here that Holmes is this kind of personality who, once the war started, he felt it was a necessity for him to fight in terms of defending what he would have considered fairyland or elfland, as they would have talked about it in educated circles, the West, the Anglo-Saxon understanding of the West. So by 1960, if you can see here, I've given you this quote from the New York Times again. T.E. Home had modified the consciousness of his age that in such a way that by 1939, his name had become nothing less than myth. And so there's this mythic quality to him, and I think had he not died in the trenches, well, Dawson and Eliot both think that if he hadn't died in the trenches, he would have become the great literary figure of the 20th century. But the fact he dies also gives him a sense of martyrdom and gives us a sense of martyrdom in dealing with him. And that's a different kind of memory. So who knows what he might have done. He may have gone the way of Ezra Pound. He may have become a fascist. And if that was the case, then we wouldn't want to remember him. Just like we don't remember Ezra Pound as well as we might have had he not gone in that fascistic direction. Eliot, of course, could have gone that way too. He had all of that kind of inclination that may have melded with some of fascism, but he ended up going a much more conservative, libertarian route, thank the good Lord. But who knows what Holm would have done. And it may have changed his reputation dramatically had he gone towards a more Mussolini-esque view of the world. I don't think he would have, but there's no doubt that he was very taken with a lot of the themes that Mussolini would later capitalize upon. So if you remember, we had talked about this idea of original sin with Home. And Home plays the kind of role that once Nathaniel Hawthorne had played. That is, he serves within that generation as a reminder of what Orthodox Christianity is. And so to us, in a place like Hillsdale, where we take so seriously the Greco-Roman Judeo-Christian heritage, we're not that shocked that someone would speak about sin. But for someone to come out of the Victorian period and the Edwardian period in England and to be so counter-progressive, to just mock the progressives so openly, and to argue that we have to start with this notion of original sin to figure out who and what we are as human beings, that's pretty stunning. And so Home plays this role not as innovator, but as reminder. What is most important, he writes, is what nobody seems to realize, the dogmas like that of original sin. These are the closest expressions to a religious attitude. That man is in no sense perfect, but a wretched creature who can apprehend perfection. That final sentence there kind of sums up Home perfectly. That man is in no sense perfect, but a wretched creature who can yet apprehend perfection. So it's not the Calvinist dogma of total depravity. It's more like 99.9% depravity. It fits much more with an Augustinian view of humanity than it does with a strict Calvinist view, but it leans towards that Calvinism. It's Calvinism just right up to the door, but without going through. So very close. And certainly when we think about what's going on in much of, say, the Catholic world at the time, where you've got all kinds of flirtations with the idea of perfection, Home is fighting that as well. So he's really taking that middle ground, and that may not seem like it to us, but certainly in hindsight, when we put him into the context of things, he really is taking that via media. So here I've given you just a couple of quotes from T.S. Eliot on Home, where we get how much there was an influence on him. Right there blatantly in a private letter to Alan Tate, Home has influenced me enormously, but it's the second paragraph that I think is so important. Right? And this is where Eliot has written in 1924, commemorating the death of Home in 1917, but trying to put him into context. Home is classical, revolutionary, and reactionary. Right? What a mixture of things. To have all of those things be said about him. He is classical, he is reactionary, and he is revolutionary. He is the opposite of the eclectic, tolerant, and democratic mind at the end of the last century. A new classical age will be reached when the dogma of the critic is so modified by contact with creative writing, and when the creative writers are so permeated by the new dogma that a state of equilibrium is reached. So what can we do with this great argumentation that Home is giving us? We have somehow to bring it into the dialogue that we're having right now, as he says in 1924, over what is progressive and what is not progressive. For what is meant by a classical movement in literature is surely a moment of stasis, when the creative impulse finds a form which satisfies the best intellect of the time, and a moment when a type is produced. So that type is Home. Home was to be this new man, the 20th century man, the man who fought against progress, but did not desire to destroy modernity, but rather to baptize it. And that's what he means when he says we have to have a modified contact with the creative writing when the creative writing is so permeated by a new dogma that a state of equilibrium is reached. And that comes about in the Wasteland. The Wasteland is that kind of perfect synthesis of the modern form with the anti-progressive ideas within it. So we'll come back to that in just a moment. But Eliot is speaking about Home, but he's also somewhat speaking about himself autobiographically here as well. So what do we have in the four quartets? This very interesting moment. We haven't read the four quartets yet, but we will. It's going to be kind of the center of this entire class when we get to the four quartets. But we find in one of the four quartets that Eliot, as he's traveling, much like Dante, as he's traveling through Purgatory, Eliot meets someone who he respects immensely, and it's this master. And as I fixed upon the downturned face, that pointed scrutiny with which we challenge, the first met stranger in the waning dusk, I caught the sudden look of some dead master, whom I had known, forgotten, half recalled, both one and many. So I find words I never thought to speak. If a street is ever thought, in streets I never thought I should revisit when I left my body on a distant shore. So this is a really profound moment, and we'll get to it when we get to the quartets, but it's a moment, again, like Dante in Purgatorio, but here we have Eliot in his path of the dead, where he meets this dead master. And this dead master is one of two possibilities. This is either T.E. Holm or it's Irving Babbitt. And we don't know exactly which one it is, but he meets this person and recognizes that the person had much to contribute, but never took things far enough. If it was Babbitt, out of free will. If it was Holm, because war took his life before his life was ready to be done. So that is one of two possibilities there with that. And then we have Christopher Dawson on T.E. Holm. And very similar to what we had with T.S. Eliot, the essential transitory character of the humanist culture has been obscured by the dominance of the belief in progress and by the shallow and dogmatic optimism which characterized 19th century liberalism. It was only an exceptionally original mind, like that of the late T.E. Holm, that could free itself from the influence of liberal dogma and recognize the sign of the times, the passing of the ideals that had dominated European civilization for 4 centuries, and the dawn of a new order. Now, that new order doesn't occur except in the poetry of T.S. Eliot, because Holm dies. But still, here we have, and this was from 1931, Dawson proclaiming this was the great man as well. So we're going to see Holmes' influence, even though he's long gone, even though he didn't write much at all, but he had such an influence in the circles he was in, as well as on the philosophy and the ideals of the time, that he still does shape the entire anti-progressive movement of the 20th century. We really can't talk about progressivism or its enemies without recognizing the fundamental principles of Holm being at the back of all of that. Even if his name doesn't always appear, his influence is very strong throughout it, to the point where I would say that when we're thinking about someone like T.E. Holm, we can actually consider him to be the very first conservative in any recognizable way of the 20th century. I think that's probably the best way to think of him. He does make an appearance in Russell Kirk's The Conservative Mind, but only very briefly in one paragraph. I think it's actually a failing on Kirk's part that he doesn't have more of him, but Kirk tries to rectify that in his own biography of T.S. Eliot, where he has an entire section on the influence of Holm. So you can see I didn't get my PowerPoint finished. I've just got laid out some of these people. The quotes are missing. We'll have a couple here from Paul Elmer Moore. But there's Babbitt at the end of his days, right before he died. So we've got him as an old man. We don't have many photos of him when he was younger. It was not something, he did not go get his portrait taken very often. This was done, I'm sure, only at the behest of his publisher, but at least we have an image of what he was like and what he looked like. You can see there he's got a deeply intelligent, very penetrating look. Remember, this is the guy who was both in a gang and on a ranch and who was running through Paris when the police were trying to track him down. This is the physical fitness guy who made you have office hours with him when he was either running or walking. It's just a eccentric in every way kind of guy that we don't really produce anymore, unfortunately, but I think at one point represented a certain type of American individualist. There's Paul Elmer Moore. We do have him, pictures of him as a much younger man. Here he is, just barely older than you guys. This is right when he's just getting out of college and heading off to graduate school. So they're a much younger man, even though he's about the same age as Babbitt overall, but obviously the picture is taken when he's much younger. Again, that kind of penetrating intelligence. Looks a little bit more interesting. I think that when we look at Babbitt, Babbitt looks just a little more middle class, When we look at someone like More, he's got a bit more of an upper crust kind of feel to him, and certainly he was, especially much more Babbitt was definitely not upper class by any means, but More came out of a lot of money, to the point where if he had decided not to be a professor, he would have been totally fine. He had a house, a second home in the mountains of New Hampshire, near Shelburne, New Hampshire, and he would usually spend half of his year just writing there. He would go up and then he would produce at least a book a year called the Shelburne Essays, and then he would teach the other half of the year. So never had to have a full-time job by any means, could have simply lived off of what he had inherited, but uses it, I think, rather interestingly. More's Christian humanism, as he says, if we're trying to figure out where he comes from, he says it's a direct line, following Greek literature, specifically Plato, all the way to the Council of, however you pronounce it, Chalcedon and Chalcedon in 451. So, as he said, there was essentially a straight line from Plato to this council in 451. And his argument in his own scholarly work, and of course he comes to Christianity backwards, right? He comes to it through Plato. He argues that Christianity must be real because it answered all of the questions and the longings of Plato and all of the Greek philosophy. So he sounds a lot, if you guys remember from Western Heritage, he sounds a lot like Clement of Alexandria, but working in a reverse direction. So we find the truth in Christianity. It seems to be true in many ways simply because it answers all of the great Greek philosophical inquiries. And he tells us, importantly, what is our highest faculty. This is Paul Ever More. Our highest faculty is the faculty of imagination, the ability to understand what connects A to B. It's that space in between A and B that matters so much. That's what we see. That's what the poet sees. That's what the intellect sees. That's what the engineer sees. The engineer is able to figure out what is in that space. This is poetic understanding, what we might call poetic knowledge or poetic diction, or simply the imagination. And one of the interesting ideas that comes behind this, and it is a very Platonic idea, Plato always described, and this is where More will get this as well, Plato always described the imagination as a form of divine madness. So when we imagine something, we see next to ourselves, and the way that he defined this idea of divine madness, literally, if we take the Greek, it is, and I can't say the Greek word simply because I'm not qualified enough, but if you take the idea and you bring it into English, the idea of divine madness is the divine mind next to the sane person. So it is the image residing next to the sane person, not within. That will be the difference with Christianity. With Christianity, the image will be reflected within the soul, though by a mirror darkly. But in paganism, it's next to us. Right? And that's the divine madness as Plato described it, and what what More will describe as well. So the imagination has in its power the ability to grasp in a single firm vision, so to speak, getting between A and B, that space, the long course of human history, and to distinguish what is essential therein from what is ephemeral. So not merely the names and the dates, but what holds together all of history, critical aspect. And then we find, for someone like Paul Ever More, that conservatism and imagination are really synonyms. To be a conservative is to be imaginative, and to be imaginative is to be a conservative because of the way it attempts to conserve that which exists in between those spaces that allows us to understand what is there. So the instinctive distrust of uncontrolled human nature and the instinctive reliance on the imagination are the very roots of the conservative temper, as their contraries are the roots of the liberal and radical temper, the lack of imagination, if any distinction is to be made, being the chief factor of liberalism, and confidence in human nature being the main impulse of radicalism. So true conservatism must embrace the faculty of imagination. And that all fits with what we've been talking about in this class, especially with the idea of what St. John says in the prologue to his gospel. What is Christ? What is the Logos? It is that which lighten up every man. Right? That is imagination. It is the image of the Word that gives us power, that gives us strength. It is that which we bear the Imago Dei and are temples of the Holy Spirit. And so we get to more again. Above all things, it behooves the conservative who appeals to the imagination of men to see that his own imagination is sound and true. So we have to cultivate that imagination. All right, I'm going to skip forward on that and that and that. But I do want you to get just a couple of other people. There's Eliot. Right? Eliot is a very young man here. His official portrait coming out of Harvard. And there's Christopher Dawson. So I wanted you to at least know what these guys look like. In my mind, Christopher Dawson always looks like a properly shaved Gandalf. So I don't know if that's accurate or not, but that's how I like to think of him. And we're going to come back to Dawson quite a bit. Okay, so that's it for the images for today. But I wanted to at least give you a sense of who these people were and what they're trying to do in terms of some visuals here. So let's turn to, let's turn to Eliot again. And I'm going to do something a little unusual. Rather than go to the Wasteland right away, I want us to listen to the Hollow Men. And so, if you don't mind, please turn to the Hollow Men in your books. And let's see what page that's on. So page 56. And notice the epigraph there, Mr. Kurtz, he dead. This is from Joseph Conrad. And the idea of the heart of darkness. So for those of you, actually, you guys are too young now, but for those my age, the heart of darkness was really made into a pretty spectacular movie called Apocalypse Now. So if you ever want to see the heart of darkness set in the Vietnam War, that's an amazing movie. Disturbing, but Harrison Ford, Robert Duvall, that really incredible cast as well. Okay, The Wasteland. I'm sorry, not The Wasteland, The Hollow Men.
The Hollow Men. We are the Hollow Men. We are the stuffed men, leaning together, headpiece filled with straw, alas. Our dried voices, when we whisper together, are quiet and meaningless as wind in dry grass, or rats' feet over broken glass in our dry cellar. Shape without form, shade without color, paralyzed force, gesture without motion. Those who have crossed with direct eyes to death's other kingdom remember us, if at all, not as lost, violent souls, but only as the hollow men, the stuffed men.
Right, I'm going to stop for a second. I want you to think about the cadence of this. It is very, very different than what we saw with The Wasteland. So we're only 3 years later. This is 1925. The Wasteland is 1922. Well, probably written in 21, but published in 22. But this is 1925, so 3 years. Eliot is still, at this point, a fallen away Christian. That is also, I think, important to understand what's going on here. Eliot had the theory, and he takes this, even when he was not in a Christian phase, he takes this from his own understanding of what he had learned as a young man in Christianity. And by the way, he rejects his Christianity because his parents had brought him up as a Puritan Congregationalist, but it was a really, really watered down Puritanism, not a Calvinism at all, except in name only. And he always felt that as a young man, when he went to church, that people were there only because of a kind of stoic duty, not because they actually believed in what was going on, but it was commensurate with being an American. What do Americans do? Well, Americans are Christian. What do Christians do? They go to church. Well, therefore, if you're a good American, you go to church. Do you believe it? Doesn't matter. You go. And that was always for Eliot. You see this in his plays especially, where he mocks this kind of empty form of Christianity. And so he's recognizing that he himself is empty of belief. And when he says, we are the hollow men, we are the stuffed men, headpiece filled with straw, this is autobiographical, not just about the kind of people he went to church with when he was a kid, but about himself as well. Now, if you remember, and I want you guys all to kind of digest this, this will be really important for the midterm, but for the class as a whole, I want you to remember that Eliot is very consciously imitating Dante. So we know that within Eliot's writings, there is a hell, an inferno, a purgatorio, and a paradiso. So we know that all of those things are there. What is not totally clear is where certain things fit. So it's obvious that the wasteland is hell, except there's the promise of baptism and redemption at the end. So it's not a permanent hell. It's a possible hell. It may be permanent for some of the characters that we meet, but for the person watching, there is the possibility of the redemption through the Chapel Perilous and through the Fisher King. Right, we have that Arthurian element there. When we get to the Hollow Men, I think we would be tempted to say, pretty accurately, that the Hollow Men really reflects purgatory in some way. These are not evil souls. These are souls that have no meaning at all. They're neither good nor evil. They're not Nietzschean, though. They're not beyond good and evil. They're below good and evil. They haven't even reached the quality of being evil. Eliot had a firm belief, and he took this from Scripture, but he had a firm belief that to be evil was superior to be neutral. Being neutral was the worst thing you could ever be, to be lukewarm. Right? To be lukewarm, I spit you out of my mouth, as we see in the New Testament. So to be evil is a greater thing. It's not good, but it is greater. So it is far better to be evil than to be nothing, right? In the way of understanding free will. Shelby.
How is Dante's understanding of purgatory really neutral though? I can see why he might caricature it like that, but it seems like Dante isn't doing that at all.
Yeah, and so that's why I want to stress here, it's not totally clear that the Hollow Man is in purgatory. In the same way that the Wasteland seems to be hell, but with redemption, possibility of redemption, the Hollow Man seems to be lower purgatorial, but not quite. Because if these empty souls remain empty, then there's no reason that they would remain in purgatory either. So it's that we know that Eliot gave us those three categories coming off of Dante. We don't know exactly how the poetry fits within it. So we can say, in general, the wasteland is hell. In general, the Hollow Man is purgatorial. And in general, the four quartets are heaven. But not always, in any way. So does that make sense, Shelby?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Peter.
How is this idea of the evil neutrality, in a sense, is it in a sense inspired by part in Dante's Inferno, where Dante realizes that Virgil tells Dante that the lukewarm can't even enter hell because they're so empty.
Right.
In the sense that it's almost like their punishment's worse than the people in the worst.
Yeah.
Because even hell doesn't want them.
Right, and that's Eliot's view as well. Right? So I don't know if that comes directly from Dante for Eliot. Eliot talks about this in his 1933 lectures at the University of Virginia called After Strange Gods, which has got to be one of the greatest titles ever given to a book. And in that, he argues, he says, the most dangerous thing for any human at all is when they become spiritually aware. It is the single most dangerous moment in history when any individual becomes spiritually aware. Because at that point, once you become aware of something greater than yourself, you do either choose good or evil. And that's why it's such a critical moment. Hopefully people will choose the good, but that's where Eliot says, for those people who choose nothing or who never reach that possibility where they make a choice at all, they're the salt that's lost its savor. They're worth nothing except to be trampled upon. Right? That's how Eliot puts it. So I hope that makes sense, Peter. It's not directly from Dante, but I think both Dante and Eliot are drawing upon similar sources there. So So that's what the hollow men is, right? These guys have the possibility of redemption, maybe, but only if they become something more than being merely stuffed with straw. Okay. Guys ready? We'll go on. Oh, sorry. My computer's telling me I'm almost out of space.
Eyes I dare not meet in dreams, in death's dream kingdom, these do not appear. There the eyes are sunlight on a broken column. There is a tree swinging, and voices are in the wind singing, more distant and more solemn than a fading star. Let me be no nearer in death's dream kingdom. Let me also wear such deliberate disguises, rat's coat, crowskin, crossed staves in a field, behaving as the wind behaves, no nearer. Not that final meeting in the Twilight Kingdom.
So one of the most interesting aspects of Eliot's poetry, and you picked this out when we were talking about the Wasteland, is the image of darkness and light. And one of the great things that Eliot is trying to tell us, and we see it here, this is the Twilight Kingdom, that even in the twilight, there's the hope of possibility. Because twilight is not darkness. It's the mixing of light and darkness, which means there is always the possibility of moving towards the light, not towards the dark. So the twilight, I think at first image, seems like, because we think of twilight in terms of the late evening, moving to dark, Eliot says it's something different spiritually. That twilight can be a very good thing, not if we remain neutral, but if we choose between the light or the dark. And better to choose the light, obviously, but if we can choose that. And notice we still get the classical images in all of this. So, eyes I dare not meet in dreams, Morpheus, right? And the whole idea of the god and king of sleep, right? The Sandman. What do we do with him? Does the Sandman come? Does the Sandman put us into nightmares? Does the Sandman con us into a world of dreams that are unreal? And then think about, as I mentioned last week, any time Eliot uses the term rat, we know there's decay. And so as we think about what's going on with the scarecrows in Death's dream kingdom, let me also wear such deliberate disguises as the rat's coat, the crow skin, the cross staves in the field. So here we're a scarecrow, and yet that scarecrow can go in a lot of different ways. It can stare at the sun. It can also be infiltrated by the rat and by the field mice. So it's unclear which way it's going to go. And we ask that it not be the final meeting in the Twilight Kingdom. And then for this next part, part 3, you guys are reading, I hope, Death Comes for the Archbishop. Like, very similar scene here from when we first meet Archbishop Latour, and he meets the cactus that is in the shape of the crucifix. Right? That nature and how it reveals itself.
This is the dead land. This is cactus land. Here the stone images are raised. Here they receive the supplication of a dead man's hand under the twinkle of a fading star. Is it like this in death's other kingdom? Waking alone at the hour when we are trembling with tenderness, lips that would kiss form prayers to broken stone. The eyes are not here, there are no eyes here in this valley of dying stars, in this hollow valley, this broken jaw of our lost kingdoms. In this last of meeting places we grope together and avoid speech, gathered on this beach of the humid river, sightless unless the eyes reappear as the perpetual star, multifoliate rose of death's twilight kingdom, the hope only of empty men.
Okay, again, we're commentary. Notice the eyes are now gone. We're totally blind. So even Morpheus can't enter into this region. The pagan gods are gone, and we have no ability to access them. So even the dangers they create They're not even there. All we can do is grope. We avoid speech. We don't want any solidity at all. Now, Eliot is talking about a spiritual state, but he is also fundamentally talking about what the world is like in modernity. So this is not purely a personal autobiographical reflection, though it is. It is this understanding, who are we? What purpose do we have? And I think, this is one of the things that Eliot has shaped me on dramatically, or at least profoundly, from my own perspective, is the idea that we have very rarely in the 20th century or into the 21st century, we've lost our purpose. And typically when we find people who have purpose, we either label them as bumpkins or hicks or naive in some way, or we just ignore them completely. And to be sophisticated in the modern world is to have everybody just do their own thing, not for there to be a common purpose, no res publica, no republic to which we can latch onto. And Eliot is saying that. This is what the 20s are like. World War I was not the war to end all wars. It was not a war for democracy. It was a war that destroyed the purpose of the old world without giving us a new purpose in this world. And so Eliot, already in 1925, is anticipating the rise of ideologies, the rise of fascism, the rise of communism, seeing that these will become false religions because the true religion has been forgotten. And whose fault is that? Well, it's ours, absolutely ours. Free will wasn't taken away from us simply because the world went to hell. That doesn't mean we lost our purpose automatically. We have chosen not to choose, and therefore we don't even have the sight of the pagan gods anymore. Even that would be a reprieve, but we don't have that. And so another theme that we'll see here in this final part of Eliot, we're now going to descend to childhood. So this becomes a childhood rhyme and poem around the prickly pear. And I want you guys to notice, not only do we re-enter childhood here, but there's also finally a grasping towards truth and towards reality. Something that falls between the shadow. We need to find out if the twilight is real. And what do we find? Well, he's not going to make it. Whatever Eliot's groping and grasping, it will be for nothing at the end. This is an utterly depressing poem. All right, all of this searching, we find nothing.
Here we go round the prickly pear, prickly pear, prickly pear. Here we go round the prickly pear at 5 o'clock in the morning. Between the idea and the reality, between the motion and the act, falls the shadow, for thine is the kingdom. Between the conception and the creation, between the emotion and the response, falls the shadow. Life is very long. Between the desire and the spasm, between the potency and the existence, between the essence and the descent, falls the shadow, for thine is the kingdom, for thine is, life is, for thine is the, this is the way the world ends, this is the way the world ends, this is the way the world ends, not with a bang but a whimper.
Okay, obviously some of Eliot's most famous poetry right there at the end, right? To end not with a bang, but with a whimper. And he takes that, by the way, from Bertrand Russell, that was part of Bertrand Russell's philosophy, that no matter how much we cry, in the end, we probably won't go out with a war cry. We'll go out with a whimper. Just kind of a, when we die. Nothing too noble. And remember, Bertrand Russell is having the affair at this time with Eliot's wife, in the same apartment. So this is a very dark, very, very dark thing going on. And for him to take this from Russell and to be that blatant about it, it is really a kind of admission of failure on everyone's part. But what's he trying to get at here? Anyone catch this? And it's easier when you're looking at it than just listening to it. What's he groping for? What reality exists that he rejects? Anybody want to take a guess? Yeah. Reagan.
The language looks a little Trinitarian in this stanza that's talking about like the descent and shadow and essence and
Yeah.
agency.
Okay, so there's a Trinitarian element. Is there something that's really blatant about this in the poem? Yeah, what's your name?
Eliana.
Eliana, thank you.
Well, the whole "for thine is the kingdom"
Yeah.
is very obviously from the Lord's Prayer.
Absolutely, right? He wants so desperately to say the Lord's Prayer, and he can't, right? And every time he says it, he backs down, right? Life is very long. Obviously not from the Lord's Prayer, but life is very long. And then what? But for thine is the kingdom. And then for thine is, life is, for thine is thee. It all falls apart. He can't do it. So you've got this really beautiful and yet utterly depressing moment. He so desperately wants to believe, but he can't. It's not in him. So he can only grope towards it. And yet in the end, he not only gives it up, but the world is over. Right? Notice, how do we usually say it in the Christian prayer? A world without end. Amen. Right? Not here. This is a world that ends not with an amen, but with a whimper. Nothing more than that. Yeah. Isaac.
At this point, is Eliot Catholic or
Mm-mm.
Protestant?
Mm-mm. Neither. He's totally rejected all of his faith. He was raised Protestant, right?
My
Raised
question-
Congregationalist.
The only reason I ask is because there's two different ones when you say, "For thine is the kingdom," and like the Catholic Mass, the priest says it. Like,
Oh,
Protestant
yeah,
prayer, like,
right.
it's
No,
mentioned.
I don't think he means it that way. And remember, Eliot never becomes Catholic, right? When he converts, he goes Church of England. So Anglo-Catholic, but not Roman Catholic. So, yeah, I think that's a great point. But for Eliot, the Lord's Prayer would have ended with, "For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory." Yeah. No, thank you. It's a good point. Good. Okay, so what else? Anybody catch any philosophy in here? Hadia?
I just had a question. With
Sure.
The way it's written on the page, it seems almost like another voice is the one imposing these things.
Yeah.
Is it like the disjunction in both of them are kind of Eliot speaking, or is he meaning for this to be kind of a divine imposition?
Right.
that both are part of it?
My understanding is it's Eliot speaking. That he is, we have on one side what he truly believes, and on the other side what he wants to believe. And even that admission for life is very long is not a happy, right? It's like, holy Moses, when does this thing end? Right? So there's an element there, but he's reaching, and the only answer for life is very long is, well, think about eternal life. But that would be a happiness, and he can't get it, right? He can't, even if he believes it's there, he doesn't believe he's capable of being a part of it in some way. That's how, there may be interpretations different from that, but that's how I've always, were you thinking of it more as God calling to him?
When I first read it, I have no context for this, so
Sure.
my interpretation isn't, that makes a lot of sense to me. But it just seemed like something else was like joining into this, but it just like fell apart.
Right. Well, so one of the reasons that I wanted us all, and I hope you guys don't mind, in a sense I feel a little guilty that we're spending so much time just listening, but I think it really helps hearing how Eliot says it. And if we just read that, if we just interpreted that without Eliot's guide, I could definitely see that. I mean, I would say, yeah, that seems like that could be, especially we've got "For thine is the kingdom" right away, that could be God's calling. And even life is very long. It's like, Eliot, make your peace, right? You could see that, definitely. But at least listening to the way he puts it, it sounds like this is his conscience or his desire in the way. And then even notice that on the page, those italicized parts become more and more a part of the main, right? They're pulled into it. And God would never say, this is the way the world ends, right? That can't be the voice of God at that point, the italicized part at the end. So, yeah, Peter, thank you, Hadia.
I was going to say, and I might be very wrong about this, but he keeps saying, like, between the idea and the reality, between the motion and the shadow, between this, between that, it's his lines, the shadow and stuff. It sounds like we were just discussing earlier about the imagination.
Yeah, absolutely.
That idea that lies between A and B, so he's kind of grasping for something within the shadow.
Yeah,
He can't
and
quite get
specifically, it's a Platonic grasping. Right? This is a Platonic view of the world here and what he's reaching for. So Plato is hovering over all the end of this. Okay, any final excellent comments and questions? We're going to come back to this, But I want to finish up with the Wasteland today and try and figure out again, what is it that Eliot is doing? So we know that Eliot is not Christian at this point, but he has been raised Christian. And we know that he is desiring something, but not quite sure that he's able to accept it. So it would be, I think, completely false to read The Wasteland as a Christian poem. I also think it would be completely false to read it as a non-Christian poem. I think we have to somehow find Eliot's past as well as his desire of the present and where he's going in the future. Now, had he not converted in 1927, maybe we would read this poem differently. But the fact is, Eliot, not long after this, within 5 years of writing The Wasteland, he converts. And it's clear that there's all kinds of incarnational imagery all over this. And the fact that he's blatant that this is an Arthurian poem tells us that it has to be Christian at some level. That the entire desire of Arthur and his court is to find the Holy Grail, the cup of the Last Supper that Joseph of Arimathea had taken. They have to find that. And so that is in all of this. And we even get references. We have our characters show up at the Chapel Perilous. We also have the character in the Arthurian Wasteland. The Wasteland is, in Arthurian legend, that time when Jesus is missing from the world. It's that time between 3 o'clock on a Friday afternoon until his resurrection on Sunday morning. In the Anglo-Catholic and the Roman Catholic tradition, this is called Tenebrae. And Tenebrae is that period of darkness, that time period. What would the world be like if Jesus were absent? So the fact is, even though Eliot is writing The Wasteland as a non-Christian, the poem itself is filled with longings of Christianity, and even the darkness of the wasteland speaks to the glory of the light in some way. So again, I don't want us to read this only as a Christian poem, but if we didn't see the Christian elements, we'd be missing so much of what's going on here. And yet, we've also got these other languages that are playing in as well. So if you turn for a moment to page 49, so I think we get the whole kind of wasteland coming together. Actually, 48, we get the west there. What is that sound high in the air? The murmur of maternal lamentation. Well, probably a Marian maternal. Most likely, Mary is upset. There's the lamentation for her son and her son's religion. By the way, I'm on page 48 there, right around line, 365? Do you guys, just out of curiosity, you know who Tiresias is? Who is he, Connor?
He was one of the Greek seers. I'm familiar with this character primarily from Oedipus Rex, but he was known for being both man and woman, and so therefore having wisdom of seeing humanity from both sides. But
he's confused too, right? This is a really interesting thing about Tiresias. He can be either man or woman, and you're never quite sure who he is. I mean, he's the ultimate kind of mythic hermaphrodite in having both parts of men and women. But you see him there where I love this. Are we on the road to Emmaus? Who is the third who walks always beside you? When I count, there are only you and I together, but when I look ahead up the white road, there is always another one walking beside you, gliding wrapped in a brown mantle, hooded, I do not know whether a man or a woman. Right? And of course, he's already seen Tiresias. So is this Tiresias? Well, probably not. But it's a god. It's probably Jesus, right? In some way. So we have this image, and you can imagine, Eliot's not making fun of Jesus. He's noticing the deification of what we see, Tiresias, man or woman, or God the Son, truly man. But obviously there are going to be characteristics within God that are both male and female as well, right? In his image are they created. So the next lines. What is that sound high in the air? The murmur of maternal lamentation. Who are those hooded hordes swarming over endless plains, stumbling in cracked earth? Trump supporters? I mean, who are these people? Right? What is the city over the mountains? Cracks and reforms and bursts not in the violent air, in the violet air. I love that. Of course, we would think violent air, but no, this is twilight. It's violet, right, in some way. And then falling towers, Jerusalem, Athens, Alexandria, Vienna, London, unreal. It's an incredible moment where the West is just decaying. And then we jump to the next page at the top. What do we find? We find the empty chapel, where only the wind is at home. In this decayed hole among the mountains, in the faint moonlight, the grass is singing only the tumbled graves about the chapel. There is the empty chapel, only the wind's home. It has no windows, the door swings, dry bones can harm no one. Only a cock stood on a roof tree. Coco, Rico, and in a flash of lightning, then a damp gust bringing rain. Well, so we've got the Arthurian chapel, where you will be tempted with the greatest temptation that your soul can handle in the chapel perilous. For many of these people, like Galahad, it would have been to be tempted with a beautiful woman so that he could lose his virginity. But we also have these other images here. We find these dry bones, and yet how dry are they? They can harm no one. And then we get a cock. Well, what's the image of the cock here? Who do we think of immediately? Yeah, Eliana.
Is it Peter?
Yeah, it's Peter, right? The betrayal. And so all of that is coming together in this. Fascinating. And yet, what do we get with the lightning? Well, there's a damp gust. And notice when we saw the rain earlier, when we saw water earlier in the poem, it either killed us, right? Death by drowning. Remember? It's the hanged man, death by drowning. And we also have that fog in London that is so thick, it's like soup. You can't see with it. But now we get a damp gust. And that is not an image that is negative, right? Suddenly there's some hope. There's a flash of lightning and then a damp gust, basically for the promise of rain. Ganga was sunken. Now we're getting into Hindu images here. Ganga was sunken, and the limp leaves waited for rain while the black clouds gathered far distant over Himavant. The jungle crouched, humped in silence. Then spoke the thunder, Da. Well, I'm no Sanskrit scholar, so I had to look all this up. But Da is the equivalent of I am what I am within Hinduism. So Da, God speaks. Right? He speaks. Dada, give, means it's Hindu for to give. What have we given? My friend, blood shaking my heart, the awful daring of a moment's surrender. Just think about that. The awful, full of grace, awful, to be full of awe. That moment surrender. Here is the free will. Do you take the chance? Do you take the leap of faith, or do you not? Why? Because in an age of prudence, it can never be retracted. That is, if you can discern good from evil, prudence, you can never take away that decision. Once you know what good is, you will always know what good is. And when you turn away from it, you have chosen to turn away from it. There's no pleading ignorance at this point. You now know that awful daring of a moment's surrender, which an age of prudence can never retract. By this and this only, we have existed. By this and this only, by good only, we have existed, which is not to be found in our obituaries or in memories draped by the beneficent spider or under seals broken by the lean solicitor. In our rooms, Da, I am. God is fierce here. I am. Daviatum. Sympathize. Incredible. Sympathize. I have heard the key. Turn in the door once and turn only once. We think of the key, each in his prison. Thinking of the key, each confirms a prison. Only at nightfall. back to Morpheus. Only at nightfall, ethereal rumors. Hey, this has to be some of the best poetry ever written, just in terms of what words are being put together here. Right? Only at nightfall, ethereal rumors. Revive for a moment a broken Coriolanus. Who's Coriolanus? Nat.
He was a hero of the Republic that Shakespeare wrote a play about, where because of his pride he betrays his people.
Yeah, absolutely. A great man who's too great because of his pride. Right? And what do we have? We have a broken Coriolanus. Right? Only at nightfall, ethereal rumors revive for a moment a broken Coriolanus. Can he be redeemed? Right? Is there a possibility? And we will see, so I told you already, whenever you see rats in Eliot, it's decay. But Coriolanus will appear throughout all of Eliot's plays and poetry. And Eliot was really taken with this guy. He understood him. He said, yeah, you're that great. How easily we fall into pride. Right? And so that kind of imagery of pride, broken pride, what pride that brings destruction, we'll see that throughout Eliot as well. There's another theme that I want to bring up since we're talking about themes. And that is, anytime you have children, they always represent innocence in Eliot. Always. Except this one moment coming up. So we're going to have this one moment where we have a kind of hellish landscape. But overall, children represent innocence. I'm here. Listen to me. Dayada. Control. And control here means, do you take responsibility for your own actions? Can you restrain yourself? Do you know what is good? Can you make choices that are good? And can you restrain yourself from making choices that are bad? Dayada. The boat responded gaily to the hand expert with sail and oar. The sea was calm. Your heart would have responded gaily when invited, being obedient to controlling hands. And I hope this is clear. This is Jesus walking on the water, right? Coming out and steadying Peter's hand. I sat upon the shore fishing with the arid plain behind me. Shall I at least set my hands in order? London Bridge is falling down, falling down, falling down. And then we have lines from Dante, which I'm not good enough to recite. Oh, swallow, swallow, and then French. These fragments I have shored against my ruins. And then we get all of the lightning, all of the sayings, dada, davyadam, damyada. And then we have this final thing from Hindu scripture, shanti, 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 the peace that passeth all understanding, right? Repeated 3 times. So there are elements of hope here in all of this, but not in everything. And that, so the possibility of somehow this coming back to us, we have, but what an interesting mix of all kinds of imagery here. So if you guys don't mind, I want us to listen to Eliot read this. So I'm going to jump forward because we listened to the first part of it.
The Wasteland.
So forgive me here. Scooch ahead.
Bloodstone, in which sad light a carved dolphin swam. Above the antique mantle was displayed, as though a window gave upon the sylvan scene, the change of Philomel by the barbarous king so rudely forced. Yet there the nightingale filled all the desert with inviolable voice, and still she cried, and still the world pursued.
So line 100 on page 40.
To dirty ears, and other withered stumps of time were told upon the walls. Staring forms leaned out, leaning, hushing the room enclosed. Footsteps shuffled on the stair. Under the firelight,
guys, I'm going to go forward just another couple minutes. Sorry.
Spread out.
We're getting close on time.
Please, it's time. Now Albert's coming back. Make yourself a bit smart. He'll want to know what you done with that
this is
money
good. So
he gave you
we're
to get
close
yourself
to the
some
end
tea.
of Page,
Indeed, I was
right in the middle
there.
of 42 at the
You
end of
have them all
section
out
2.
here and get a nice set, he said. I swear I can't bear to look at you. And no more can't I said, and think of poor Albert. He's been in the army 4 years. He wants a good time. If you don't give it him, there's others will, I
Sorry,
said.
bottom of 41.
Yes, sir, she said. Something of that, I said. Then I'll know who to thank, she said, and give me a straight look. Hurry up, please. It's time. If you don't like it, you can get on with it, I said. Others can pick and choose if you can't. But if Albert makes off, it won't be for lack of telling. You ought to be ashamed, I said, to look so antique, and her only 31. I can't help it, she said, pulling a long face. It's them pills I took to bring it off, she said.
She's had an abortion.
I've already nearly
Hope
done
you
it,
caught that.
George. The chemist said it would be all right, and I've never been the same. You are a proper fool, I said. Well, if Albert won't leave you alone, there it is, I said. What you get married for if you don't want children? Hurry up, please. It's time. Well, that Sunday Albert was home. They had hot gammon. And they asked me in to dinner to get the beauty of it hot. Hurry up, please. It's time. Hurry up, please. It's time. Good night, Bill. Good night, Lou. Good night, May. Good night. Ta-ta. Good night. Good night. Good night, ladies. Good night, sweet ladies. Good night. Good night. The fire sermon. The river's tent is broken. The last fingers of leaf clutch and sink into the wet bank. The wind crosses the brown land unheard. The nymphs are departed. Sweet Thames, run softly till I end my song. The river bears no empty bottles, sandwich papers, silk handkerchiefs, cardboard boxes, cigarette ends, or other testimony of summer nights. The nymphs are departed, and their friends, the loitering heirs of city directors, departed, have left no addresses. By the waters of Lehman I sat down and wept. Sweet Thames, run softly till I end my song. Sweet Thames, run softly, for I speak not loud or long. But at my back in a cold blast I hear the rattle of the bones, and chuckle spread from ear to ear. A rat crept softly through the vegetation, dragging its slimy belly on the bank, while I was fishing in the dull canal, on a winter evening, round behind the gas house, musing upon the king my brother's wreck, and on the king my father's death before him. White bodies naked on the low damp ground, and bones cast in a little low dry garret, rattled by the rat's foot only, year to year. But at my back from time to time I hear the sound of horns and motors, which shall bring Sweeney to Mrs. Porter in the spring. Oh, the moon shone bright on Mrs. Porter and on her daughter. They wash their feet in soda water. Et oh, ces voix d'enfants chantant dans la coupole. Twit, twit, twit. Jug, 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 so rudely forced. Tirou, unreal city, under the brown fog of a winter noon, Mr. Eugenides, the Smyrna merchant, unshaven, with a pocket full of currants, CIF London, documents at sight, asked me in demotic French to luncheon at the Cannon Street Hotel, followed by a weekend at the Metropole. At the violet hour, when the eyes and back turn upward from the desk, when the human engine waits like a taxi throbbing, waiting, I, Tiresias, though blind, throbbing between two lives, old man with wrinkled female breasts, can see at the violet hour, the evening hour that strives homeward and brings the sailor home from sea, the typist home at tea time, clears her breakfast, lights her stove and lays out food in tins. Out of the window perilously spread her drying combinations, touched by the sun's last rays. On the divan are piled, at night her bed, stockings, slippers, camisoles, and stays. I, Tiresias, old man with wrinkled dugs, perceived the scene and foretold the rest. I too awaited the expected guest. He, the young man carbuncular, arrives, a small house agent's clerk, with one bold stare, one of the low on whom assurance sits, as a silk hat on a Bradford millionaire. The time is now propitious, as he guesses. The meal is ended, she is bored and tired, endeavors to engage her in caresses which still are unreproved, if undesired. Flushed and decided, he assaults at once. Exploring hands encounter no defense. His vanity requires no response, and makes a welcome of indifference. And I, Tiresias, have forsuffered all enacted on this same divan or bed. I, who have sat by Thebes below the wall and walked among the lowest of the dead. Bestows one final patronizing kiss and gropes his way, finding the stairs unlit. She turns and looks.
You guys caught that, right? What was going on? They had sex, and it was totally meaningless. There was nothing to it at all. His ego, her indifference.
It's a moment in the glass, hardly aware of her departed lover. Her brain allows one half-formed thought to pass. Well, now that's done, and I'm glad it's over. When lovely woman stoops to folly and paces about her room again alone, she smooths her hair with automatic hand and puts a record on the gramophone. This music crept by me upon the waters, and along the Strand up Queen Victoria Street. Oh, city, city, I can sometimes hear beside a public bar in Lower Thames Street the pleasant whining of a mandolin and a clatter and a chatter from within, where fishmen lounge at noon, where the walls of Magnus Martyr hold inexplicable splendor of Ionian white and gold. The river sweats oil and tar, the barges drift with the turning tide, red sails wide to leeward swing on the heavy spar. The barges wash, drifting logs down Greenwich Reach past the Isle of Dogs. La 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 ya, la 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 ya la la. Elizabeth and Leicester. Beating oars, the stern was formed, the gilded shell, red and gold, the brisk swell, rippled both shores, southwest wind carried downstream the peal of bells, white towers, la 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 ya, la 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 ya la la. Trams and dusty trees. Highbury bore me, Richmond and Kew undid me. By Richmond I raised my knees, supine on the floor of a narrow canoe. My feet are at Moorgate, and my heart under my feet. After the event he wept. He promised a new start. I made no comment. What should I resent? On Margate sands, I can connect nothing with nothing. The broken fingernails of dirty hands. My people, humble people who expect nothing. La la. To Carthage then I came, burning, 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 burning. O Lord, thou pluckest me out, O Lord, thou pluckest, burning.
Okay, I want to stop there. We'll pick this up on Thursday, right where we're at, but I want to note one last thing. And if you saw this, especially reading the footnotes, we have this interesting mixture here at the end. To Carthage, then I come, burning, 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 burning. O Lord, thou pluckest me out, O Lord, thou pluckest burning. Where, if you see in the footnotes, Eliot says that he's mixing Buddha's fire sermon with St. Augustine's Confessions, which is really fascinating that he would do that. And something we should probably think about. Once again, what do we do when we're bringing all these different faith traditions into this? Okay, thanks everybody. God bless. I'll see you on Thursday.